You're listening to Contesting Wrestling Premium.
Premium. Oh, this is premium?
This is going to be in the Forbidden Zone, behind the paywall.
On Patreon.
Does that mean that we're going to take sexy photos for this one?
You need to know the secret password.
We don't have a high enough tier for sexy photos yet.
Yeah.
Perhaps in the future.
The highest tier is for Doc.
I do need to add that to the goals. The
highest tier is for me only because I would definitely lose my teaching job, and so it would have to be worth it. So
you're not gonna make the calendar of
Well, we could give Evan away with the normal tier, right?
Oh.
Just because I
just
don't
because you're
respect
cheap,
myself doesn't mean that we can just give me away. Wait, it does, because of the society we live in. Oh, I turned it around into commentary.
There you go.
That's what you do.
Handle it. Unfortunately, we do live in a society. It's terrible.
I'd rather just wander around in the woods myself. So what are we getting on?
In like a Jungle Boy thong?
I'm not a socialist. I'm an socialist. I want there to be no society.
No society.
I like it.
I'm a squoshalist. Try to decide what that means.
Squosh. We're doing the compliment to the Montreal Screwjob this week. For anybody who is listening to this, but for some reason has not listened to the previous episodes.
And what the heck is wrong with you?
Yeah, what's going on? We are joined today by the literally immortal Betsy Ross.
Hello.
You cannot be slain, and you are a independent wrestling referee.
That cannot be slain, except if someone grazes me slightly.
And by popular demand, Ms. Ross will be now a semi-regular contributor here on Contesting Wrestling.
Wait, what? Does that mean I get paid?
You'll get paid as much as we get paid.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Which is roughly negative $12 a month.
That's slightly less than it was before we had the Patreons happening. People are jumping on.
Seriously.
Thank you, everybody.
It was Patreon subscribers. You don't understand how much you have made a difference in my unemployed finances. It's amazing.
In my professional referee finances, which is basically being unemployed.
You got $10 that one time.
So
one time I got 20.
That's incredible.
Did you take any bumps that time?
No.
So the Montreal Screwjob.
No, and if you don't know, by the way, what the Montreal Screwjob is, I don't know what to tell you. You're listening to the wrong podcast.
By the way, we talked about more than one screw job on that episode.
Yes, we did.
The Montreal screw job and then the New York screw job.
Oh, the early. I don't think it has a proper name, the Wendy Richter screw job. We only really touched on it towards the end because we spent so long talking about Montreal, rightfully so.
Yeah.
But it's a very interesting case in and of itself. We'll expand upon that a little more here.
Right. So the premium episode today has matches that relate back to both of those screwings. The first of which is another match between Bret Hart and Shawn Michaels for the WWF title, an earlier match to the Montreal Screwjob. This one from WrestleMania 12, the Ironman match. 60 minutes. The most falls scored in those 60 minutes would declare the winner had there been any falls scored in the 60 minutes.
Part of why we're doing this match specifically, I mean, it obviously directly relates to the Screwjob, but also I had requested an hour-long match. I had learned of their existence and was fascinated to know if it could work, if two wrestlers could make something consistently interesting, and then you guys were like, oh, by a massive coincidence, we need to think of stuff to do for the Screwjob compliment episode, and there is an hour-long match between Bret and Shawn.
Two wrestlers who you have not been particularly averse to.
If there are any two wrestlers that I could watch, these are two guys who I think it would work, and it did not. This is way too goddamn long for a wrestling match. I can't do it. This felt like an amazing 20-minute match.
Yeah.
I mean, it hurt that there weren't any falls the whole match, that they weren't even really trying to beat each other for most of it.
Yeah, that's how I felt too. It's like, and I think Doc pointed out kind of the same thing. They're wrestling it more like an hour-long match that happened to just go an hour and go
Yeah.
to a time limit. Not a match where they're like trying to get the most done. Like they do the whole slow build thing, and it's like it's not that kind of match. I don't think.
Right, when you're having an Ironman match, you expect to have a few falls. You know, there's a pace that they just didn't keep up. The pace of a match, like I find this match to be overrated. Like people will say it's this crazy classic, but I think people thought it was a crazy classic because they'd never seen any other hour-long matches, so it was just sort of extreme.
I mean, also as a kid, this was Bret Hart and Shawn Michaels, the clearly two greatest wrestlers of all time, my two favorites at the time. And having wrestling for an hour and showing that neither could beat each other for that hour. And to me, at the time, this was like the platonic ideal of a wrestling match.
Sure.
Like this was the greatest match I could possibly imagine.
And if by platonic you mean about 90% of it had no passion, yes, because most of it was just arm bars and headlocks. This match would have been very at home as an NWA title defense in the 70s. But it wasn't. It was the main event of WrestleMania in the 90s. They needed to do a bit more. And I love both of these guys, of course, but
Same.
Platonic doesn't mean no passion. It does mean no sex, though.
well, there was
So
no
there you go.
sex
There was no
at
no
WrestleMania 12.
there was no payoff. There was no
Yeah.
climax,
And
really.
you want to talk about a screw job. They finished the match. Brett releases the sharpshooter and leaves because he's the champion. He went an hour. It's a draw, right? But no, they call him back to the ring and restart the match, and then Shawn kicks him in the face and wins the title. And if they were going to go into some kind of overtime, the Bret Hart, especially the character who had spent the whole match trying to get to the sharpshooter, wouldn't have released the hold.
When that happened, when they called everybody back and was
Yeah.
like, "Oh, the match has to keep going," that was the first time that I felt my wife resent me for doing this podcast.
Oh, man.
While we were watching, because came out, she's on vacation now,
Yeah.
and she came out at 6:30 in the morning, and I had already been watching wrestling for like an hour and a half at this point.
Yeah, so
and,
just this match.
and she was like, "Oh, this'll be nice," and I could just feel her getting more and more like, "All right, like I'm on, it's my day off. Like, can we watch something else? Jesus Christ, what are we
please
doing?"
watch Doctor Who.
And she often enjoys the wrestling. And I will amend my criticism. It's less that it feels like a great 20-minute match with a lot of padding, is that it felt like 6 pretty good 10-minute matches.
Yeah.
That had the pacing of 10 minutes where they'll have an exchange and then rest holds and then an exchange and then rest holds and then nothing will happen and then back and forth, which is like fine to have that level of not much happening in a 10-minute match, but having it all strung together, I don't know, man. It felt like there was no rise and fall.
Yeah.
It picked up at the end a little bit, and I'll also just say, to have it end 0-0, like they could have gotten the exact same effect and made the match 1 million times more interesting by having it end like 3-3.
Yeah, well, there's something to them not doing a bunch of falls too, because the idea is neither of them could beat each other. Like I think the issue was that they signed the Ironman match in the first place. If the idea was they didn't think either one of them could beat each other in future Ironman matches that they would do, and they didn't do another one for years on television, there would be very high scores, and the matches were a lot more like exciting, But by then, everyone was kind of beating everybody else. Back at this point, it's like if you were on top of the card, you didn't lose a lot of matches. You didn't lose a lot of falls. And I think they didn't want to portray them to be beating each other a bunch because they hadn't been able to in the past. But whatever. To say something nice about the match, like all of the stuff that they did was perfectly well executed.
Absolutely.
I understood the story of the match. Like you say, like rest holds, I don't necessarily think they were rest holds because they started with them. It was a very slow build. They both established what they were trying to do, with the arm bars and the chin locks and the leg holds.
HBK worked that one arm bar for like 20 minutes.
Yeah, and Brett would sell it more and more over the course of the match. Like, oh, my arm, ow, which is proper.
They also did pepper in some interesting spots over the course of the match.
Yeah.
For instance, the timekeeper getting the sweet chin music.
Who did we figure out that was?
I think it was Tony Kimmel.
Yeah, we were pretty sure that's young Tony
Kimmel?
Kimmel. Kimmel, yeah.
I have a bit of a digression about something it made me think about, but Ben, you looked like you had a point that you wanted to get
I wanted to get
before I
back
do it.
to Doc talking about Brett having to release the sharpshooter.
Yeah.
This is the first time they screwed Brett. Like in the storyline, he totally, and
Yeah.
this, like, I was sort of ready, and I think I even did, even after this for a little while, I was ready to accept Shawn Michaels as like the new top guy, and that Brett was passing the torch to him. But this really kind of made me bitter towards Shawn, and I definitely felt Brett's dejection, which he expresses very well as he walks out afterwards. He never would have released the hold if he had known that that was the deal. It's interesting though in terms of the rules, because they never mention the sudden death rule, right? That if it's a tie at the end, they'll go into sudden death overtime. Roddy Piper, who had been the president leading up to WrestleMania 12, had declared that there had to be a winner, ambiguously. Gorilla Monsoon, who was the newly appointed president at WrestleMania, interpreted it in his own way. So, there's enough, again, ambiguity in there that it's made sense while still taking at least Brett, but I think both competitors by surprise.
Well, Monsoon was an interesting case there. He had become interim president of the World Wrestling Federation when Jack Tunney, whatever happened to Jack Tunney? Do you know what happened to Jack Tunney?
He got eaten by a pack of wolves, I believe.
That's the traditional
And then
death in Canada.
And then after the pack of wolves ate him, they kind of like melted and ran into a pile and then reformed, and it was Vince McMahon.
That's
I thought he
fantastic.
finally realized that he had already been dead for 10 years.
Maybe, judging by his promos.
Finally rested.
Anyway,
then the wolves ate him.
The signature of Gorilla Monsoon's like presidential reign, if you will, is that he would mess with the rules kind of a lot, and it was the first time anybody did. The rules needed an updating, and they did it properly within the storyline. He would say stuff like, "The referee's decision is final," to clarify specifically that if there's some shenanigans during a match and the ref at the end of the match says this is the finish, that was the finish. And you can have a rematch, you can contest it later, but we're not just going to overturn a match because the ref missed a broken rule in there.
Which Jack Tunney would do often, but totally inconsistently.
Totally inconsistently, and the fans didn't like it.
I remember at the end of King of the Ring when Yokozuna beat Hogan after the Japanese photographer's camera exploded in Hulk Hogan's face.
Yeah.
And then after the match, Jack Tunney's there in the locker room congratulating the new champion, Yokozuna. And I'm like, dude, you saw the fucking camera explode in Hulk Hogan's face.
It's just the indifference of politicians to, their constituents suffering.
So
I'm going to guess that they stopped doing those descend from the roof entrances like Sean does after the Owen Hart tragedy.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. This was the first time they had done one. Famously, like, they were a little iffy on like, oh, is this safe? Isn't it? And when they were testing it, Vince is just like, it's safe, I'll do it. And then Vince harnessed himself in and ziplined to the ring, and he was like, there. So they did it, and it was fine. Sean was dumped into the crowd. It's a wonder he wasn't torn to pieces.
And I mean, usually those 99.5% of the time or something ridiculous like that, I'm sure that stuff is safe. It's just that one time with Owen, it wasn't.
Yeah.
I bet Brett was extra bitter about it, like, oh, you didn't kill Shawn Michaels when you did it.
Right.
Sean gets into the ring and has and simultaneously does his sexy dance and has some trouble getting his jacket off.
Yeah.
And that in a way that I find, and I was impressed at how he maintained like the sexy boy persona while very clearly having a lot of trouble, and then it got stuck on the back and it was a whole pain in the ass. And then his manager came
Jose Lothario, the super sock.
at the point that they were looking at each other, him and Vince were looking at each other, Jose Lothario was kind of like polishing Sean. Like it started off as like a reassuring pat, like you got this, but then it turned into a real, like, it was like he was polishing his shoulder.
He'd have a much easier time polishing Sean now.
Because he lost his hair.
He's shinier now.
And his
Speaking
eyes
of
don't
hair,
point in the same direction.
how about those bangs? that Sean was sporting.
Oh,
for
yeah.
this match.
How about that everything that Sean was sporting?
Cute.
Sean always has hair levels above 35.
He's just a sexy boy.
Yeah.
I mean, he doesn't anymore. Have we shown Evan what Sean looks like now?
I think I've seen. I saw a picture from one of the Saudi matches. I think
he finally shaved his head. When he does like promos and interviews now, which is rarely, he's been wearing over the years larger and larger cowboy hats, not just to hide how bald he was going, but that his eyes are pointing in more and more different directions, and he wants to hide all of that. Kind of feel sorry for him that in his like mid-50s now, he still has to come out to like sexy boy, and he's like, I'm a
sexy
the
man
best.
now.
No, he's the best.
I'm a family man and a born-again Christian.
I'm just a family man. Family man.
Yeah, man.
I love Jesus. Jesus.
He does a there's a few times he does this move to Brett, which I thought was a great example of the ways that you can adapt yoga into violence, where he's basically does like a downward dog into a knee strike to the face.
Yeah.
Downward dog into a knee strike to the face.
He jumps and brings his knee down. I know what you're talking about. Yeah, it's a good one. You curl up like a spring and you bounce forward.
And are there slammies? Are the slammies real, or is
Yes.
that just a reference?
Yeah.
A joke
The
they
slammies
make?
are a real thing.
They're a little inconsistently done, but yes, there are the Slammy Awards.
The first or second, I think it's the second Slammy Awards, is a really interesting show to watch. That's where Vince does Stand Back.
Right, he sings Stand Back, and it's one of the first times, if you know what you're looking for, you can see he's just insulting everyone he's putting out of business right now.
He's showing us the Mr. McMahon character, 10
Mr.
years
McMahon,
before.
Right.
Because it's his true self.
I don't have my phone on me. Could one of you guys bring up a picture of the Slammy Award to show to Evan?
Yeah.
Yeah. It's statuesque statue for sure.
I will say the crowd was right there along with them for all those technical exchanges.
Yeah. Well, they were in the building though, ready for to watch specifically that.
Right.
Like I don't want to crap on the match like, oh, it's a bad match. It's not a bad match. It missed its mark in a couple of times, and I find it overrated. Yeah, that's the Slammy Award.
That's pretty cool.
It's good.
It's an
Yeah,
Oscar
good.
throwing another Oscar.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Our friend Matt, who's going to be a guest on this podcast soon, he has a Slammy Award.
Really?
And for him, that someone bought for him
Cool.
on eBay or whatever. But he believes that he really deserves to have it because he was at, I think it was the year after the night after WrestleMania 29, the Monday Night Raw, which is probably the most famous of the Raw after Manias, where the crowd was, sort of took over and was the main part of that show. And there was that crowd or that moment was awarded a Slammy as like the best moment of the year or whatever. So he's like, I was part
there.
of that crowd.
I'm gonna make a big abstract stretch here.
Oh boy.
And talk about, because this is what happens when I wake up at 5 a.m. to watch wrestling, and I'm really high by 5:07 a.m. while I'm watching wrestling.
Stretch it.
AM bong rips.
And so when you're thinking about how to structure something that is largely improvised for an hour long, it kind of made me think about Indian music. And the way especially that it works in northern India. I am hardly an expert in this. This is half-remembered stuff from a class I took in my 20s.
Were you really high during that class too?
I mean, it was after I was 14 years old, so yes.
Okay.
This is all, and also a lot of this information is half-remembered stuff from what the great musician Gabriel Marin has told me over the years of our friendship, who is on our theme song.
What up, Frost Ox?
And then, go listen to his band, Consider the Source. They're great. So in Indian music, or at least in northern Indian music, the way it usually works is in the classical music is that when you go play something that's an hour long, you're playing a raga, which is sort of like a scale that has rules attached to it, and there's various forms that you use, but something that is universal in that is an opening section called an alap. And in the alap, you can play all of the notes in the scale, and it's sort of like you're establishing the rules of what's going to come. Mm-hmm. And this match a little bit, because there was a flurry of activity at the beginning. and it sort of made me think about how like they're kind of demonstrating like, oh, like here's what the match is going to be about. Here's what the story of the struggle between Brett and Shawn is going to be here in the opening section. And then after you get through that opening section, then in the next section, the name of which I can't remember, you're supposed to then just kind of drop down, and you're like only going to play like a few notes at a time, and like that's where you start kind of rebuilding. And then when you get to the end after an hour, that's when you're doing all of the stuff, and you've built on it heavily. A lot of this might be not super accurate.
That makes super sense. That makes tons of sense to me.
No, I'm kind of getting it in an abstract sense.
Oh yeah, well they start the match. They counter each other's moves a bit. Brett starts getting frustrated that Shawn isn't falling for his old tricks. They establish what holds they're going to be using over the match, what body parts they're going to be working on, and then for the next hour they take those concepts and they move them forward. No, that makes perfect sense to me.
A few flaws that I see just in the execution of the match. One thing is that Brett really doesn't go for the damn pin. Like he has this moment where Shawn flips completely out of the ring and almost takes out one of the cameramen.
Yeah.
And then, Brett doesn't let him get counted out. He interrupts the count out.
Right.
Later on, he would not interrupt the count out, but then kind of do it anyway. Brett seems conflicted about whether he should let Shawn get counted out.
Or like near the finish, Doc was next to me going, go, turn him over, go for the pin. Like Shawn's like face down, and Brett spends like a little too much time just poking at him and like trying to do more moves. It's like, no, he's face down and out. Flip him over and go for the pin.
Yeah, he kept doing moves and then picking him up to do another move,
right.
Which is kind of like, I remember listening to, I think, Al Snow talk about that's kind of a cardinal sin psychology-wise.
Yeah, I think that the idea is that Brett kept trying to go for the sharpshooter, but even that, he only tried a couple times during the match. Like, he should have been always trying to get him in the sharpshooter if that was the deal.
Also, towards the end, I don't know if he gets a little blown up, but Shawn starts to forget what he's supposed to be doing.
Now we're in.
That arm that B mentioned that he was working the whole match, he forgets at one point which one he's doing.
Yeah, no.
And I think you can kind of see Brett be like, no, it's the other one. And he switches to the other one.
I mean, I can't imagine if I go to the gym and I work out medium hard for an hour with lots of breaks and stuff, I can't fucking speak or like form memories at the end of that hour. Like I am a broken man. I can't imagine wrestling a match for an hour.
Look, it's Earl Hebner in this match.
Yeah.
Look at Earl. He's like glistening.
Yeah.
I don't know. He can go forever, but he seemed really happy when it was time for him to lay down for a minute.
It's got to be such a relief when that's done. And that's the thing too, is like I understand having an hour match if it's like a small show out in like the boonies or something. Like I can imagine an untelevised match, right? An untelevised hour match where you're there. It's a lot more intimate. It's a lot more of an immediate thing. Obviously, wrestling live holds your attention a lot more.
There's no ring. There's just a pit of mud.
Yeah, exactly. You're instead of holds, you got knives and
10,000 people. They drew 10,000 people, but it wasn't taped.
They actually had tried these matches on house show runs a couple of times. One with Bret Hart and Ric Flair, and one with Bret Hart and Owen Hart. They called them marathon matches at that point, not Ironman matches. I think I've seen one of the two. I think it was the Owen one. And they were very, very similar to the match they ended up doing. So they had tried it a bunch. They did that a lot. Like Bret would have an idea, and he would do it on the house shows, and then eventually they'd give it to Shawn Michaels.
Right. Shawn would put his flair on it, and then he'd be the one that would do it really well on pay-per-view.
Put a little Shawn sauce on there.
Yeah, a little Shawn sauce, a little Shawn spice.
That was true for the ladder match,
yeah.
And for this as well.
It did occur to me for a different Shawn Michaels match we watched for an upcoming episode. It was the first time it occurred to me during Shawn's whole entrance. I was like, oh, when the fireworks go off, that he's coming.
Yes.
That's what. Yes, I didn't. I can't believe that didn't occur to me.
Because he's a sexy boy.
Yeah.
And then later, that's when he'd get down on his knees and like pray and stand.
right.
In the later half.
When he came
now
back.
I'm coming in God.
Exactly.
Only Jesus makes me jizz.
So let me point something out about the match. You know, that to contrast it with more modern wrestling. You know, Sean doesn't throw a million super kicks. As much as like he made everyone like to do super kicks and everyone does it because Sean did it cool, he knew when to throw it.
He'd hit that one.
Yeah, he threw the one and he hit Tony Kimmel and then they stretchered him out. They're selling it like if he connects with that kick, it's over. And even in the overrun, when he finally beats Brett with it, he hits 2 of them and the first one was clearly not like it. And it took him forever to make the cover, and then he hits him with the real one.
What differentiates a super kick from a regular kick?
It's just they call that form of kick a super kick. I don't know what the technical
like
term
where
of
he
it
like
is.
winds up and does the full like leg slapping like straight kick to the face. That's a super kick.
That
It's-
side thrust kick to
side
the
kick,
face.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, the big one that Shawn Michaels hits is the super kick.
Also, contrast with modern wrestling, he does like one kind of head scissors kind of move
Yeah.
and maybe a moonsault at some point, and you have the announcers all like, "Oh, Shawn Michaels with these high flying Mexican maneuvers."
Right.
Yeah, and Brett's just doing pile drivers.
Oh, yeah. A while into the match, Brett pulls out the pile driver, and I thought that was an interesting psychological thing. Like, I thought I would have beaten him by now. So, you know, Ben, as you'd pointed out, like the pile driver represents a disregard for your opponent's well-being. And it's a dirty move, even if it's. I like how Jerry Lawler was like, I can't believe he kicked out of the pile driver, because it was Jerry Lawler's finish in Memphis when he was a younger guy. So he would always put it over when someone would hit the pile driver. No, that's clearly it. He drove his head into the ground.
What do you think Brett was going for with that weird kind of botchy thing off the top rope that turned into almost like a code breaker? Like he had his knee in Sean's back. It's when they bumped the ref.
I think they were just going to bump the ref, and it was an awkward-looking thing, that's for sure.
I think it might have been supposed to be a top rope bulldog, but Sean
maybe.
was too close to the ropes or something like that. I don't know.
Bret Hart is buff in a way you don't see much anymore.
Yeah.
Where he's a top heavy buff. Like he's got a weak butt, and like
he's got no ass.
his legs are like small and seemed kind of small in comparison to the rest of it. I feel like our modern conception of buff is a much more balanced
It is.
thing,
Yeah,
whereas
especially-
he is a very top heavy, like
Especially coming out of the 80s. It was
Yeah.
all upper body.
Yeah, what you're seeing there is somebody who's trying to follow Hulk Hogan, who was super top heavy, except Brett wasn't on steroids. So
Not by then, at least.
Yeah, so he didn't get that huge, wide, like impossible body. He went to the gym every day, did cardio, and then did arms and chest.
Another thing about the high-flying Mexican maneuvers,
Yes.
Lawler then says, you know, they're really fancy, but they don't have much effect, which is kind of true.
Yeah, I mean, yeah.
As-
That's
as
why
we-
matches that have them in them these days, you do 1 million of them and everyone just jumps back up. Shawn Michaels got more mileage throwing a slightly crooked moonsault than most people do these days throwing any of them. But that's, you know, it's just a factor of the wrestling business as moves change and move values and worths change. Like a move itself is very neutral. You have to educate the audience as to how much damage it does.
So we've got Stu Hart at ringside there.
Yeah, sitting
being-
next to Freddie Blassie.
A cumulative age of 174 at that point. No, 274.
274, yes.
And Sean shakes Stu's hand at the end after
Yes.
he wins the title. One thing about the Hart family, this is actually going back a couple of premium episodes. We neglected to mention a really important thing about that Undertaker debut match from Survivor Series 1990 that ended up between DiBiase and Bret Hart in the end as the final two. One of the Hart brothers, one of the 57 Hart brothers, had died that morning. Dean Hart.
Yeah.
And Bret was wrestling with that in the back of his mind.
Roddy Piper mentions that on commentary there, just briefly. You know, he's not trying to bring everyone down. He's just like, Bret's wrestling for his fallen brother, and there you go. And
I thought, that was an important omission that
yeah,
I wanted to plug back in.
I do like that there is a recurring theme with Bret Hart of like the honor of his family, and like his family is physically present to judge him
Yes.
in case things go south.
This brings us to one of our other matches.
The
Boom.
next match. Perfect segue. Evan, everybody.
Psychic connections. And then that was the podcast equivalent of like when two jazz guys will start playing the same melody at the same time.
So are we moving on to
Yeah.
Vince versus Brett?
Please, I hope you're getting your fucking money, premium listeners. Your money's worth.
Also part of the segue, though, last thing I want to say about the Iron Man match, the video packages. I remember Bret Hart complaining in a shoot interview about how much of a contrast there was between Shawn training for the match and Bret training. Like, Shawn is shirtless, doing upside-down push-ups and all this shit, and they have Bret getting beaten up by his 85-year-old father.
And swimming in his giant pool. It's like, this is my biggest problem with Bret, though, as a huge Bret fan. Yeah. That was the story. Right. The new rugged Texas babyface is beating the established traditional champion. So you play the part of the traditional overconfident champion that then loses.
And this is why I think Bret knew that. And he was still playing the damn character in that shoot interview. But
that's a whole other story.
You've already heard what I think about all that.
So this match,
Bret Hart versus Vince McMahon. This is WrestleMania 26. Now, in 2010, Bret Hart has mended ties with the WWE. He has returned. In the story, he even shakes Vince's hand, and then
Vince kicks him in the balls.
Vince kicks him right in the balls.
That was an episode of Monday Night Raw. I was watching it. In an era where I usually caught a recording of Raw later, I watched this one live because, oh man, Bret's coming back. The whole episode, they peppered Bret in. He mended ties with Shawn Michaels. They shook hands like it's water under the bridge, guys. Sorry, we were all younger.
A bit of historical context behind that first episode that Bret was on for the first time. It was January 2010. This was their answer to TNA Impact going live on Monday night. If anyone remembers, I was at that TNA show. Regret. Anyway, I was.
Hogan was there.
Yeah, Hogan was there. But I was at that just because I lived in Florida at the time. So TNA had been like, we're going to go live on Monday night and see how it works. And WWE's response to that was, we have Bret Hart.
TNA
have the end of this storyline that's been going on for 13 years now. We're finally,
real life
exercising
storyline,
it. Well, yeah. It's the final catharsis for fans. This emotional burden
Closure.
they had been carrying for all that time. Yeah, was finally being consummated.
Now, I don't know if that I think it's more of a coincidence than not, because I don't think the WWE really cared what TNA was doing. I think that people in WWE would have predicted exactly what happened, which is TNA had one kind of hot week where they got about half the viewers Raw did, and then Impact just drove into the ground. Within 3 weeks, they had half those viewers. Within another couple of months, they were off of Monday nights because they could not compete with the WWE head-to-head. If they had just gotten a better primetime slot on a different night,
their ratings plummeted.
Yeah, nobody was going to watch their show over, nobody was going to be like, I'm going to give the alternative a sample. Oh, look, even older Hulk Hogan, even older Ric Flair.
Oh, look, the Nasty Boys are still alive somehow.
And they're not drug testing Jeff Hardy. He's clearly inebriated. What's happening on Raw? Oh, Bret Hart is punching Vince McMahon in the face. I'm going to watch this.
I've heard about this Samoa Joe, but they're not actually showing him to us in any meaningful way.
Know who I really missed in this match when they bring out all of the Harts? You know who I'm going to say, Keith Hart.
Yeah.
Had he died?
I don't think
Bruce
so.
as the ref. No, I think Keith is still kicking.
Keith is still there.
Then
What was the one Hart brother that started looking a lot like Stu?
Smith, maybe? The
Smith
oldest?
Hart, yes, the oldest Smith Hart. He's starting to look a lot like Stu.
At one point, they're like, the Lumberjacks are reffing this match, but then it's one of the Harts. Is that
Okay, so let's explain this.
Let's explain what's going on.
All right, a lumberjack match is a kind of wrestling match.
It's a match that honors the fact that lumberjacks are the heroes. It is the most dangerous job in North America.
That's true. It is
the most deaths.
Yeah.
Well, I really don't know the history of the lumberjack match.
Oh, I know the story behind it.
Oh, Doc,
so
please.
the idea is, I don't know exactly where it started. I can presume it started in a place where there was lots of trees, which was most of
Canada.
America at the time, or Canada. But the idea is when the lumberjacks would have a problem with each other, they'd fight, and all of the other lumberjacks would stand in a circle around them to make sure either of them wouldn't run away or that they could have a fair fight. And so the lumberjack match is a bunch of wrestlers surround the ring to throw you back in the ring if you leave the ring.
Can I just say, my first thought as this match starts to play out is, this makes Vince kayfabe look so damn dumb.
This is the most contrived, double cross or whatever Brett called it.
Yeah.
And it's funny. This season of Rick and Morty, there's this whole episode about how the heist genre is really stupid, and there's all these contrived, oh, it was my plan all along. My plan, your plan was actually part of my plan, and this really reminded me of that. Well, let's explain what happened, I guess.
So it seems like it did not accurately reproduce lumberjack justice, which is the law of the forest.
Yes.
But it's what did Vince think was going to happen? He paid them all up front, and they're all and they're Brett's brothers and sisters and nieces and nephews and stuff. What did he think was going to happen?
Not a ton of depth to this match.
So the idea was that it was just an excuse to get all the Harts around the ring.
Right.
And the idea was that Vince had paid them off to support him as lumberjacks and as the ref. He explained that kind of confusingly because it doesn't make any sense.
Right.
And then it turns out, of course, that since they've gotten paid, they have no incentive to actually help him. And so they're going to help Brett.
And that they've gotten paid because Brett says, as though they've all turned on him, oh, so I know you're all the Harts, right? So you all got paid up front, right? And you've cashed all your checks and all the money's in the bank. All right, great. Yeah, Vince, you just paid my whole family and they're still on my side.
And that reveal is so bad because it's just Brett explaining it to us. Right?
Yeah.
There's no thing that happens that reveals that it's a double cross.
And like I said, it makes Vince McMahon look real dumb because this is exactly what everyone knew was going to happen. As soon as the Hearts started coming out, they're just going to turn on Vince again.
Although I will say one thing that was smart of Brett to do was wear those Jenko things that he's got because it really, really hid how weak his butt is.
Yeah.
Oh my! This jean shorts, and he has white socks with sneakers. It's come on, Brett.
There's something important that we haven't mentioned yet, and the reason that this match really went like it went, Brett had a stroke earlier.
He could not wrestle.
He could not. And this was
2002. He had the stroke.
Yeah, and this was a couple of years after his career had ended due to multiple severe concussions. He had a large insurance payout. Predicated on the fact that he wouldn't wrestle anymore. And they had to negotiate with the insurance company of what Brett could and could not do. And one of the big things is that Brett couldn't take a flat back bump, period. He did a couple of his falling elbows onto his front where he could stop himself with his hands, but at no point did anyone hit him and he takes a bump. Now, Brett stuck around for a little while after this and had a few more matches, and the fans accepted it because it was Brett and they knew it was a short-term thing. But all of his matches were multiple-person schmazes. Sometimes he'd get hit in the face and put his hands up and crumple to his knees and then carefully lay on his side to sell.
And when Doc says he had a few more matches after this, what he means is Brett had a United States title reign.
Yes.
He did win the United States title during this time.
He worked with The Miz, one of the greatest heels of all time.
But yeah, this match is just the retribution for the Hart family. It is just Brett purging his emotions all the fuck over Vince McMahon's back and head with chairs and a fucking crowbar.
And all the other Harts kicking it.
All the Harts kick him and beat him. The David Hart Smith and Tyson Kidd, who are a great tag team. Natalia was there, but David Hart Smith and Tyson Kidd do the Hart Foundation finishing move, the Hart Attack, to Vince on the outside of the ring.
Yeah, his head bounces off the ground and everything.
And it's just this relentless, merciless beating with Vince screaming like the old man that he is.
It's a straight line.
It's hard to watch.
It's like the 1812 overture, but just the cannons. And like, if you're into that, great. And as far as the end of the story goes, it was fine. It wasn't really too long. But the really uncomfortable thing was at the end when Brett got Vince in the ring with that chair. And it's like, and Brett's doing it right. You know, he gets the chair, appeals to the crowd. The crowd's on their feet like, yeah, get him. So he hits Vince. The crowd goes nuts. And he hits Vince again. And the crowd goes nuts. And then he hits Vince 10 to 20 more times. And the crowd starts sitting down. And it just starts getting uncomfortable as this guy just beating up this old man with the chair.
At what
Stop
point?
hitting him. He's already dead.
Yeah.
No. The line is the line at Professor Abelson is stop. He's already dead.
Okay.
There is one point where Brett starts beating Vince with what appeared to be a windshield ice scraper.
I thought that was a crowbar.
I think it was a crowbar.
Was it like a little
Yeah.
tiny crowbar?
Well, they were all big dudes.
Yeah, they're big
is
guys.
even Vince
Oh,
is like
okay,
6'2".
they're not
and,
that
like,
big. Where
Is
it looks
Vince, like,
like
6'2"?
little
Vince is
tiny,
a
like
big
fucking
dude, yeah.
doll furniture,
Yeah.
fucking crowbar. Like I'm not. He would have to be like 14 feet large, based on your. Okay,
Yeah.
I'm
But,
gonna
it
believe
was-
you that it was a small crowbar, but I don't.
I like to point out at the end when everyone gets in the ring to celebrate, right? The new Hart Foundation guys just couldn't get it together to stand in the lineup and raise everyone's hands. And Natty, you can hear her scream like, Tyson, over here, face the Hart, Tyson, over here.
And that's why
finally-
Natty outlasted all of them. Well, Tyson
Yeah,
also
well,
had a horrible career in it.
Tyson broke his neck. He's still employed by them. He's an agent on the road still. He was a very good wrestler, and it's tragic that he broke his neck in an in-ring accident with Samoa Joe.
One other part of the beating that's notable, Brett would always tease the sharpshooter by holding the guy's legs open
Yeah.
and then stomping on their midsection.
Yeah, and it's very pointedly not their groin.
But this time, he very pointedly stomped on Vince's groin.
Right in the nuts.
Yeah.
Right in the nuts.
Yeah, and then his brother there as the ref, just like, all right, you know.
If you're ready, I'd be happy to move on to the match that I actually enjoyed watching this week.
Oh, yes.
So
Cool.
speaking of Wendy Richter, who was involved in the other screw job where they, where the Fabulous Moolah sort of ripped the title away from her.
Yeah.
Yes, B is going to have a lot to say about the Fabulous Moolah. But this is Wendy Richter against Leilani Kai for the WWF Women's Championship at the first WrestleMania.
Yeah.
We've covered matches from quite a few WrestleManias. I think almost half of them
At this point,
at
maybe.
this point. But this is the first time we're covering a match from the inaugural WrestleMania, which was at Madison Square Garden in 1985. And while the main event involved Hulk Hogan and Roddy Piper and Mr. T and Paul Orndorff, this was probably the second most high-profile match.
Yeah, Wendy Richter was a huge star, and she was going to be the cornerstone of their women's division. She didn't want to play ball with Vince, and that's fine. They did her pretty dirty.
And more than her being a big star, she was cornered by Cyndi Lauper.
Right.
Okay, so I had like a vague knowledge that Cyndi Lauper was somehow involved with wrestling in the 80s. I had no fucking idea that she was like she straight up character in wrestling and was amazing.
She was a big part of this angle. She was on TV a lot for months. They did a big cross promotion with MTV, which was actually cool at the time. Wrestling manager Captain Lou Albano was in the music video for Girls Just Want to Have Fun. He's
Who
the
also
father.
was Mario.
Yeah, he was
Yes.
Super
Yes.
Mario in the
Okay,
Super
yeah.
Mario Super Show.
Yeah, and they did an angle where Roddy Piper smashed her gold record over Lou Albano's head
Yeah.
and punched Cyndi Lauper herself,
And,
body slammed her manager,
David Wolf,
Wolf.
yeah. No, she loved it. She thought it was great, and they all had a great
got
old
it.
time. She got it.
She
She
got it, yeah.
understood.
So the story
Because she was really like a weird artist, you know.
Oh, yeah.
But she was like Lady Gaga. She put out a pop album, and then you look at her, it's like, oh, you're strange. It's like,
this
yeah.
was why for like a second Gloria Steinem was like, oh, maybe wrestling is something feminist.
Yeah.
And then quickly learned
And then
that was
Moolah
not the
kept
case.
holding it down for another decade.
I will say on a like meta level, like pulling back a little bit.
Yeah.
This is not meant to be a criticism of anybody specifically involved in this match, but just generally, now with almost 40 years of ability to look back on things, when you see just like the aesthetic of the 80s, it really is the end result of nobody saying no to white people for 500 years. Where it's just like the fact that people were like, yes, I'm going to go outside like fucking this today and it's all gonna be fine. This is a
Yep.
normal thing to do.
And everyone was on cocaine.
Yeah, I guess
my
that's really,
God.
and I guess that's really what it was, is that we had yet to really see the long-term effects of cocaine use as being negative.
White people, white powder.
Yeah, and then making sure that the people growing the cocaine were not getting properly compensated.
And then when black people started using cocaine-involved products,
Yeah.
they were litigated against much more harshly.
Yeah,
and
10
all
times,
that stuff.
roughly
times.
10 times, in fact.
Oops, I started a political conversation. Whoopsie poopsie.
And then
It
they
happens.
they know what they're getting into at this point, listeners.
Yeah.
That's what makes it premium.
Yeah.
So the match itself was pretty it was rough, and I don't mean rough. It was bad. I mean it was rough. The two of them were fighting over this
man.
championship. You know.
Wendy gives, I think the move is called a Widowmaker.
Yeah.
You got the person on your shoulders, and then you slam them in this interesting, torqued kind of way.
Yeah.
And that was the best one of those I've ever seen. She really
Yeah, Richter was
nailed
good.
her with it.
I didn't realize that, like, I knew that women's wrestling existed in the 80s. I guess
Yeah.
I really didn't know that, like, good women's wrestling was there, where they were doing real
Oh, yeah.
wrestling on each other. And, like, I guess I had assumed that it was just all, like, cheesecake matches. Is that
That was in
term?
the 90s and in the early 2000s, but that's also when that developed. The wrestling, women in wrestling were either wrestlers kind of akin to what you just saw, or they were valets who were supposed to look like good, but they were supposed to be like classy ladies in gowns.
Miss
You know?
Elizabeth.
Yeah, Elizabeth or Sherry and her elaborate costumes,
Yeah,
you know?
the development of women's wrestling over the years has not been like a straight upward slope.
Yeah.
You know, it's been a bunch of progressions and regressions.
Sure.
Right.
Yeah, Sable ruined it for everyone for a while there. No knock to Sable. She was good at the role she was in, but she was so good at that, like, hot chick role
Yeah.
that they're like, oh, let's just make the whole division that.
At the same time, they kind of brought back the women's title for her.
Yeah.
And at the time, the division did have a lot of Sable type wrestlers, but there were also some really good wrestlers at the time.
Oh, yeah, Ivory was incredible.
Ivory was great.
Luna was still there.
Jacqueline.
Molly Holly.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
I also like that Cyndi
Jazz.
Lauper.
Oh, Jazz was incredible, too. We're getting a little later now after Sable.
Sure, but that was that stretch of the title that came in for
Yeah.
Sable
Yeah,
initially.
and then they had thought of the Diva Search, and I could just
That's
go
when it
on.
got really bad
I
for me.
could just go on. Yeah,
We,
no.
we can cover that someday. That'll really piss Evan off.
Oh no, we make him watch the first Diva
It'll-
Search in its entirety.
piss
That'll-
all of us off.
That'll have to be a premium episode because of the amount of swearing involved.
I just like that Cyndi Lauper had a manager, so it was like that the wrestler had a manager, and then the manager had a manager, who was
Right.
a meta manager.
Well-
Manager Inception.
I got to manage the ways in which you manage.
Billy Wolf was one of the main architects of the rock and wrestling connection, as they put it. He was since he was one of the businessmen involved, he could make all of the connections between the different strains of talent between wrestling and the music world.
There is a film starring Roddy Piper that's like the entire rock and wrestling
Yeah?
thing. I've seen it once. I don't remember what it's called, but we should dig it up because
Yeah, we should dig it up.
We are going to have to do a Roddy Piper episode
Oh, yeah.
in which we not only watch wrestling but watch the classic B movie that we have referenced before that I have only seen parts of. I've never seen the whole thing. But Welcome to Frogtown.
Oh, yeah.
I thought you were gonna say They Live.
That's what I thought you were going to say too.
Oh,
but
no,
that's
they-
not a B movie.
No, yeah, They Live is an
No, They Live
actual
is an
good
actual
movie. Yeah.
I think it's Hell Comes to Frogtown.
Hell Comes to Frogtown.
He plays a man
yes.
named Hell.
Yes.
And he goes, well, I'm not
And he
going to
has to-
spoil the movie,
yeah.
but
Well,
you
he's-
could...
it
Does
involves.
he go to Frogtown?
Well, yeah, but
Damn it,
they bring him to Frogtown to fuck, right? Like that's
Yes.
the whole deal. Is that
No,
they,
that
like,
is the whole deal.
Yeah.
He's like the last man on Earth, and they need him.
Yeah, he's got to fuck his way through a bunch of frog people.
Dude, it is a proper B movie.
Yeah.
So I want to talk a little bit about the story leading into the Richter Kai match.
Okay, yeah, good.
So Richter had defeated Moolah for the title with Cyndi Lauper in her corner. But then there was a match between Kai and Richter where Moolah interfered so that Kai could win. So the story of the match at WrestleMania is Cyndi Lauper preventing Moolah from interfering in a way that could cost Richter the match. And so Richter is able to be victorious and win the title back from Kai. And I just love Lauper. attacking Moolah in a way that's, I don't know, doesn't seem particularly effective. She's like hitting her with a towel. And in the post-match promo, Lauper's like, yeah, I brought my towel with me.
I mean, if Wendy Richter had really wanted to get Moolah out of the way for the match, she could have just called the police and had Moolah arrested for pimping.
Yeah, so, Ms. Ross, why don't you educate our listeners about the infamous nature of the fabulous Moolah?
So how much have they told you about, like, the backstory on Moolah? And it's only become more prevalent in the last, just, like, I would say 5 years or so.
I would say they have
something like that.
They have either not told me any of it, or they have told me it, and I have completely forgotten.
Well, it really started around, like, probably, like, 15 years ago or so, when they did Lipstick and Dynamite, and all those women who were getting older finally were like, all right, time to shit on Moolah.
So there was a film called Lipstick and Dynamite, about...
You said you haven't seen it.
Yeah, I haven't seen it. It's about the history of women's wrestling?
Yeah, and Doc has seen it, so he can input. And they bury Moolah in it. It's really when it finally started. So Moolah, supposedly, from an outside perspective, was made to be the savioress of women's wrestling for something like 50, 60 years.
Good 25 or 30 years for sure. She was not only was she the biggest star in women's wrestling, she controlled women's wrestling. She owned the title. She owned the touring circuit. She trained the women herself. She was the agent for the women to license them to other wrestling shows across the country.
What do you mean she literally owned it?
She literally owned the belt, correct?
Yeah, as in, like, if you wanted to have a World Women's Championship match on your show, you would contact Moolah.
Okay.
And Moolah who would usually just be the champion herself, she would come to the town and she would bring her girls, and that would be the women's circuit. And Lipstick and Dynamite, it was on Netflix. I don't know if it still is, but it's an excellent documentary about, women's wrestling kind of through 1980. Yeah, they interview a lot of really old ladies, and a couple of them defend Moolah and say all of these women were just jealous and, she wasn't doing anything wrong. But most of the women just bury Moolah. They say she was a tyrant.
She was
some of them
literally
said,
a pimp at points.
Yeah, some of them said she had sold her girls off for sexual favors to promoters and, whoever would pay, etc. And a lot of them were like really like, how like people
Sweet
who
Georgia Brown.
Yeah.
Oh
one
yeah,
of the
you
most
wouldn't
notable.
even get an interview with her because she literally like once Moolah was done with her, she ran away from wrestling forever and like
it was over.
Yeah.
People who leave the WWE will be like, man, WWE, I got concussions and I didn't save my money and everything was terrible, but man, Vince would still do anything for his company. Yeah, that last part didn't apply to Moolah. Moolah was just a taker.
Growing up, Moolah was the icon of women's wrestling. She was the only women's wrestler of the past that was ever referenced at all. And then she and Mae Young, who was another wrestler of her generation, returned to the WWF in the late 90s, both well into their 80s, and had a bunch of matches and would get like power bombed through tables and stuff, which was amazing. Mae Young especially seemed, like tough as nails throughout her entire life.
The guys who they were working with at the time said that Moolah and Mae Young would both like go up to them and be like, "We're working tonight," and they're like, "We'll be careful," and they're like, "You're not going to be careful. You're going to treat us like wrestlers or we're going to beat the crap out of you." And, that was just the deal. Like, Bubba Ray Dudley said that Mae Young got close to him, like an inch from his face, and just said, "The next time you hit me like I'm one of the boys." And scared the hell out of him. And there you go. They loved being back in the spotlight. And Mae Young was, an unsung hero of the past. All the other women were unsung heroes. It was cool that Mae Young got hers through like her 90th birthday. On her 90th birthday or somewhat, they brought her out.
They like a diva on each arm, making sure she could stand up.
They kind of got her to the ring and rang the bell, and a few women came in and kind of just bounced off of her a little bit, and they had her win a match just to say she won a match in her 90s.
It sucks that she didn't get her 100th.
She passed a few years back. She wanted to have a match when she turned 100, but she was
made
great.
it into her 90s though.
Being a professional wrestler that lives into your 90s.
Yeah.
They still use her name in a positive light. They do the Mae Young Classic tournament, which is a tournament of new women's wrestlers who they're kind of trying out for the WWE.
Yeah.
They, for a moment, used Fabulous Moolah's name for a WrestleMania Battle Royal.
They had to undo it.
There was so much outcry against it that they actually, what was the sponsor? I think it was Snickers.
Yeah,
was
it was
finally
Mars.
like, we're hearing all this stuff about Fabulous Moolah. We don't want you to use her name for your battle royal.
Yeah, it was the Mars company itself that
Damn.
owns Snickers.
Yeah.
And it's like Mae Young. You can say she wasn't as bad. She was an accomplice, though. She was definitely. I mean, her and Moolah lived together for their entire lives almost. With their what you say this, Doc. With their midget.
That's how they put it. What was her name again?
Katie Glass.
Katie Glass. She was in Lipstick and Dynamite. She had come out, Mae Young, and be like, "Oh, my midget, how you doing?" And she was like a live-in butler servant person.
The story goes she was like a 16-year-old runaway that showed up at Moolah's for training, and she just never left.
Yeah, and they were all a little weird family together. I mean, cool, I guess.
That's either an innocent and moving tale of outcasts finding each other, or a horrific cover for God knows what sorts of abuses.
Indentured servitude.
Yeah,
I think would be the lightest way to put it.
Do we have anything to say about Leilani Kai?
Leilani Kai also had the women's title match at WrestleMania 10 against Alundra Blaze.
I felt bad for her in this match because clearly it wasn't about Leilani Kai. Clearly it was just fucking about Moolah again.
She was third wheel as you could get. Everyone else in this match was more important than Leilani Kai.
I didn't say Dakota Kai earlier in this episode.
No, you
did
said
I?
Leilani Kai. Dakota Kai is incredible though.
Yeah, she's great.
Yeah, she's
And
finally
I
breaking
just
through.
realized the kind of perhaps reference there.
Well, it's possible, man. I mean, Leilani Kai was a significant women's wrestler in the 80s, but she didn't achieve nearly the fame as Wendy Richter or, of course, Moolah.
Though
Now,
knowing what a geek Dakota is,
Yeah.
it's probably more of a Cobra Kai thing.
Quite possibly. So the reason that WWE was so all in with Moolah, not only did the opinion on her only really start to turn recently. She saw what Vince was doing in the 80s and went in on it. She sold the women's title to Vince. She knew enough to cut her losses, and she was kind of it's like being accepted into the mob, and she was accepted in, and she was a made woman until she died. That they always treated her name with respect. They would like show her in the front row, like the Fabulous Moolah, and she should be sitting next to Fred Blassie, and they'd be talking shit on the younger guys. But at the time, the women's wrestling was still very Moolah-centric, and it could have moved on, but it didn't yet. And there was a huge hole.
It hurt it.
It hurt it very much.
So much that it was still about Moolah, even when Moolah was by this time Moolah was already in, like, what would you say, like her 50s?
She was in her 50s at this point. Yeah.
Yeah. But they still refused to move on from it being Moolah-centric, even though like she sold the belt.
Well, they wanted to move on to. They wanted to move on to Wendy Richter, but Wendy Richter wouldn't do exactly what Vince said. And Vince is pretty ruthless, and he was more ruthless then. And it was a bad time to not be doing exactly what Vince said in the wrestling business.
damn. That's how. I mean, I guess we'll have to get into that more at some point.
Yeah, well.
Or we've said as much about it as we ever need to say.
On a lighter note, there was one other funny thing from the Ironman match that I didn't mention before. Shawn Michaels' music hits, and they announce, the Heartbreak Kid, Shawn Michaels, and Jose Lothario comes out.
Right, and there's no Shawn Michaels.
Because he's going to zip line down. But for a second, it's like, oh, Shawn, man, he's really not been taking care of himself lately.
Shawn aged so quickly.
This old limping guy.
All right, we any final thoughts?
One other also, well, go ahead, B. What do you?
I don't like Moolah.
Yeah, fuck Moolah. And one other thing about Shawn Michaels and that match, they really sold him winning the title as his boyhood dream, right? That he had been a wrestling fan his entire life and had worked his entire life to get to this moment. And that at the time was a kind of new wrestling story. This has been a new generation of wrestlers, starting with Shawn Michaels, who started out as fans. And that wasn't really something that you saw before. Now that's every wrestler.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. And not only is that every wrestler, like for the WWE, every wrestler has grown up watching specifically the WWE.
And specifically Shawn Michaels.
And Shawn
It was a
Michaels,
dream he had during his sexy boyhood.
That's right. Which has never ended, apparently, according to his theme music when he still comes out to this day.
I'm just a sexy boy with
Sexy boy.
baldness, male pattern baldness, and arthritis.
Baldness.
male pattern arthritis. I'm assuming.
Sexy arthritis.
This has been you can have arthritis and still be sexy, and that's
Yes,
what I
that's right.
want people to take away from this episode. This has been Contesting Wrestling Premium. You guys are the best. This is going to be coming out. This might be coming out on New Year's, I think. So happy New Year.
Yeah.
I hope that
Deuce deuce, as I like to call the coming year.
'tis 2020.
Double deuce.
Deuce.
Luckily, time's not real. So we'll see you next time.